Good afternoon and welcome to the Barbara Olson Memorial Lecture. Before we start, I want to ask Ted Olson to say a few words about two of the Federalist Society and Barbara Olson's close friends whom we lost in the last couple of months. Ted?
It's always such a great pleasure to look out at the audience for the Barbara Olson lecture and to think about the smile that would be on her face for her to be able to see the people that come to listen to this lecture. As you know, we come together this evening to remember Barbara Olson, a passionate Federalist pioneer. Barbara would have been important or insisted, however, that we take a few moments of her time to acknowledge and reflect on the lives and passing of two of her dearest friends and mentors, supernovas of the legal world, longtime luminescent Federalists and true American patriots. Judge Kenneth W. Starr, and Judge Lawrence H. Silberman. Jean admonished me to be brief, as our time this evening is limited, and I will, of course, heed Jean's admonition and guidance, but these two Federalist Society legends and friends deserve special recognition on this occasion. It is hard to envision two individuals who accomplished more at such exalted levels in our legal and political lives over such extended periods of time than these two individuals, and who affected American history and civic life in such profound ways. Kenneth Winston Starr was 76 when he died just 2 months ago on September 13, a tragic end to a spectacularly productive, versatile, and influential legal career. Ken's personal history was prodigious. Clerkships on the Fifth Circuit, and 2 terms with the Chief Justice of the United States. He was a partner in 2 of the nation's most prestigious law firms, Chief of Staff and Counselor to the Attorney General of the United States, a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, Solicitor General of the United States, and he was selected by a federal court to be independent counsel to investigate President Clinton. After that tumultuous service, he then became Dean of the Pepperdine Law School and then President and Chancellor of Baylor University. Ken was an author, a professor, and scholar, a member of countless civic boards, an amazing number, and a respected and successful attorney in private practice. He was a devoted husband, father, and grandfather. And in 2002, he delivered the Barbara Olson Lecture. Many of us would be proud to have held 1 or 2 of Ken's lofty positions, but Ken somehow did all of that and more. Yet impressive as his service in each of these roles, Ken was admired particularly for his style, skill, grace, accessibility, and humility. He discovered, developed, and mentored an amazing who's who of lawyers, young lawyers, including, to name just 2, Chief Justice John Roberts and Associate Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Throughout his memorable career, Ken was the epitome of dignity, professionalism, decency, and kindness. Even under ruthless, relentless attack during the Clinton investigation, he maintained his composure, never once responding in kind to the savage, personal invective hurled at him. The term gentleman is often overused, but rarely earned, except in Ken's case. He was unfailingly a gentleman, a cordial, generous, and gracious man. He was always there when his friends needed him. He was among the first at my home when Barbara was murdered, spending days answering the telephone and handling every task that was put before him. He will be dearly missed. It is daunting to capture the essence of Larry Silberman in a few words. A life of his accomplishments, creativity, courage, and independence is exceedingly rare, if ever seen at all. Larry Silberman was an overarching presence in American law and American history. His relentless, fierce, probing intellect and aggressively provocative challenges to conventional wisdom were legendary, surpassed only by his warm, impish humor, an unfailing friendship to his colleagues, his mentorship to countless among us, and his always available avuncular wisdom. The words courage and fearless appeared in every one of his obituaries. He was a provocateur and a gadfly. Larry Silberman passed away on October 2, 2022, just short of his 87th birthday. The Wall Street Journal characterized his contributions as a jurist as among the most respected, successful, accomplished, and consequential in American history never to have served on the Supreme Court. Sad that he never attained that pinnacle, but he was every bit, if not more, influential nonetheless. Larry served in top positions in the Labor Department, helping to develop many of today's nation's labor laws. He was Deputy Attorney General in 1974 during the height of the Watergate scandal and played a vital, courageous role in keeping the Watergate Special Prosecutor's Office intact after the Saturday Night Massacre. He was Ambassador to Yugoslavia. He was confirmed by the United States Senate 5 times, not ours by friends. Larry Silberman helped elect Ronald Reagan president and became not only a valued confidant to William French Smith, Ronald Reagan's first Attorney General, but a constant source of wisdom, judgment, and experience for President Reagan and his team. In Larry's 30-plus years on the D.C. Circuit, he was admired and cherished by his colleagues, intimidated the lawyers who appeared before him, and beloved by the scores of clerks for whom he was a mentor, friend, and confidant. He was central in many of the D.C. Circuit's most important decisions, too many to enumerate here, but including the meticulous decision upheld by the United States Supreme Court that the Second Amendment's protection and guarantee to citizens of the personal right to keep and bear arms actually meant a personal right to keep and bear arms. He had the chutzpah to call out the media's golden calf, New York Times versus Sullivan, as conspicuously lacking in constitutional grounding. And he was a personal hero to me for his decision striking down the hideous independent counsel law in a case called In Re Sealed Case, a decision mistakenly reversed by the Supreme Court in Morrison versus Olson. On a personal note, Larry was the individual many of us turned to on those occasions when we needed sound, discreet, and professional advice in times of stress or controversy. and he performed my wedding to my current wife, Lady. We honor and give thanks for the life, brilliance, and inspiration Larry Silverman gave to us his entire life.
Thank you so much, Ted. I really appreciate that. And this is the Barbara Olson Memorial Lecture, and we've just had 2 memorials. I wanted to do one other. I want to express, today is Veterans Day, and I want to express a gratitude and a moment of silence for all of our veterans. Thank you. Well, I do want to welcome you formally to the 21st Annual Barbara Olson Memorial Lecture. I'm Eugene Meyer, President of the Society. And this lecture started, as many of you know, shortly after 9/11. Ted Olson's inaugural lecture reminded us of what it means to be an American and how our legal tradition is a critical part of our identity as Americans, and perhaps under certain kinds of challenge now, too. But that reminder, we want our lecture series to emphasize so that lawyers foster principles, legal principles that advance individual freedom, personal responsibility, and the rule of law. Today, I want to introduce Professor Richard Epstein. Professor Epstein, sorry about that. Professor Epstein has had a long and distinguished career. He has taught at Chicago for years. He's taught at, and he now teaches at NYU. He's been at Hoover. He has been just one of our leading scholars in his generation, perhaps the leading legal scholar of his generation. He's best known for his work on takings, perhaps, but he's contributed major scholarship in most areas of the law. With 16 books and too many articles to count, the breadth of his scholarship is obvious. The overall theme of his work has been developing structures which work in practice with human incentives. And he always will go wherever the ideas take him and explore problems and challenges with integrity and a commitment to bettering the human condition. In addition to his scholarship, I want to say one other thing. There are few, if any, who've done as much to help the Federalist Society as he has. He's addressed thousands of us at conferences, but also at our chapters around the country. His energy and his commitment are matchless. So I want to conclude this introduction by saying a heartfelt and profound thank you to Richard Epstein, our 2022 Barbara Olson lecturer. Richard?
It's a very great pleasure to be here. I will say only 1 or 2 sentences about Barbara, since Ted did not. I met her one time in my life. It was at the marriage of my niece to John Manning, and the two of them were there, the perfect couple. And I said hello and thank you. And Ted did not remember the event today, but when I reminded of him, it all came back. And it takes only one time to see Barbara to understand the excellence of her personality, the strength of her character, and the general all-around goodness that was so senselessly taken away a year after that particular event. Now, coming here is a great honor, but I have to confess that it is not without difficulty. So I'm going to begin with a story of human frailty, namely my own, which I could not have given 15 minutes ago. I'm getting in the elevator to come downstairs from 2, and I press 1 and end up at 10. And that's usually the way in which I manage to organize affairs. And I get in there, and there's this big brute of a man who comes in. He's wearing sort of a lumberjack jacket and so forth. He says, "What are you doing up here?" I said, "I'm trying to go down to 2. I have to give a lecture to 1. So I turn around and face forward. He says, "You can't go out like this." And what he does is he turns around and he straightens my jacket back. And so it turns out that I'm in a proper, respectable position. I'm not going to turn around so that you could examine his handiwork. But I want you to know that on any one of these occasions, it always takes a lot of help on small things to be able to do lectures on larger ones. So that... So that's where it is that we begin, and now the question is, where do we go from here? Eugene Meyer, I've known now since the first meeting of the Federalist Society, and he is, I think, the Ed Sullivan of the legal profession. He has profound influence, he stays on the stage forever, and he always manages to add a contribution without hogging the limelight from his subsequent speaker, which I, again, thank you on this particular occasion. But he has been, in effect, a tower of strength. And as I went back yesterday and listened to the events, it was Gene, it was Lee, it was Steve Calabrese, it was Gary Lawson, it was everybody up there. And it turns out these are people with whom I worked very closely at the beginning. And one of the things that happens on an occasion like this is that when you're doing a 40th anniversary, you start to think back to the sweep of time, rather than thinking solely about the current events that take place. And that's exactly the kind of nostalgia that overtook me. And so then the question is, how do I get a speech which has that particular sweep? And those of you who know me well will know where I'm going to begin. God forbid I should begin with the Constitution or even the Magna Carta. Those two things are hopelessly modern. Everything I do and start with comes out of its Roman law background and origin. And this is going to be an occasion exactly that way. Later on, I'm doing law talk with John Yoo and with Troy Senik, and since Roman riparian rights have been a running joke on that show for 8 or 9 years, I will not talk about that. Well, what I will talk about are 2 themes that essentially relate to exactly what Eugene Meyer said in my particular efforts to figure out how it is that we structure various kinds of legal relations in order to bring out the best of human beings. In order to do all of that stuff, what you have to do is to get the simple stuff right, starting first. And so what happens is if you're trying to figure out what's wrong with the modern administrative state, you can do no better than to begin with the articulation of 2 Roman maxims and see how they are betrayed as we start to move forward in time. And the first of these is one called audi alterum partem, which means hear the other side. And the second is nemo iudex in causa sua. Nobody should be a judge in his own cause. And so the first thing you want to ask is, well, why would you want these particular regulations? And the answer is that a way to show you the close connection between substantive law on the one hand and procedural law on the other. So if you take the first of these maxims about essentially hearing the other side, and imagine what happens when you don't hear the other side. What happens is you get one particular side of a dispute. That's going to form the particular judgments that you're going to make. And if there was a distribution of outone which would be observed in a state of nature, what you're going to do is generally switch you from that particular distribution, skewed in one particular direction in favor of the party who speaks. And that fundamental asymmetry will therefore destroy judgments. If you talk about the question of why it is that you have to have an independent judge, well, you think about what happens when you start to play dice with a loaded pair. And so it turns out, instead of having it 50-50, it turns out to be 4 in one direction and 2 in the other direction. And you start playing that. And what will happen is by the time you're done, you'll have a probabilistic taking. That is, the expected value in an honest case would be 50%. The value that you get in a dishonest case is 66 versus 33. And it turns out that you've managed to take 1/6 of the property from one party to give it to another. So the important thing to understand is there's a common tradition in modern law which says that we think about substantive due process in one area as a kind of a contradiction and procedural due process somewhere else. But the thing to remember is every deviation from an appropriate set of procedures results in a transfer of wealth that is illicit from one party to another. And so that gets you back to my favorite subject, Mr. Meyer, which is this turns out to be a taking of one kind or another, and you can understand the way in which it plays out. So keeping to these particular principles turns out to be absolutely critical. And then the question is, what's their scope and their durability? And going back to our good friend Gaius, he's another Roman lawyer, he said the test of a good law is, does it spread across geography to different societies at different places, and does it endure over time, again with the same kind of situations, and does it have some kind of a natural reason, which I've already given to you with the probabilistic theory. And if you start to look at the other kinds of things, what you will note about the 2 laws that I've given you is they're not tied to any particular kind of dispute or to any particular forum or to any particular set of parties. No matter what you're doing, no matter where you're doing it, no matter how you are doing it, if you do not observe these 2 particular situations, the nature of the game may change, but the risk of perversion and distortion and transfer of wealth remains constant. And so therefore you have to keep your guard up at all times to make sure that these fundamental safeguards are not going to be disregarded. And how does this manifest itself? Well, as you start moving forward in time, these things get incorporated not only in the civil law tradition, but in the common law tradition. In the English courts where I studied in England, it was called natural justice as part of the natural law system. It then becomes part of the law of the land. It comes to the United States, and all of a sudden the same notions are now embodied in due process of law, one kind or another. And the reason why all of these principles link together is that their universality cannot be challenged by anybody unless you're favored of skewed outcomes by dishonest procedures. And so the thing to remember about this is that we have a realist tradition today that is much too large, much too powerful, which starts to say that when you're talking about legal rules and so forth, the last thing you want to worry about is their durability. What you want to do is to figure out how in the moment the things that you're about to do are going to be better than the things that have been done before. Well, how does this work itself out? Well, in the American system, I think for the most part, for a very long time, the principles that we had about due process were pretty much protected. In addition, I think there was 2 sets of safeguards that you have to do in order to understand their particular protection. One of them is structural, and the other is substantive. The structural one turns out to be the familiar doctrines about separation of powers and checks and balances that start to take place. If you have a system in which the executive enforces the law that's designed by the legislature and adjudicates those cases before a court, you will sound like a simpleton to some people, but you will sound very wise to somebody like me. And what has to happen under this is that last step, which is the independent judiciary, is in effect a way to reduce the risk of bias that's going to be associated by having the legislature or the executive or some combination of the 2 of them make the particular laws that are going to govern this particular case, essentially treating the judiciary as part and parcel of that overall process. And so keeping that separation is critical. Even if that separation is critical, however, it remains the case that when you are running this particular judicial system, all of these constraints have to be scrupulously observed and protected. So I would say that the due process logic is got somewhat broader scope than does the separation of powers, even though the 2 of these things are basically directed towards the same end. And if you are an American constitutional lawyer, the first principle of constitutional design is belts and suspenders. You never want to rely on a single set of guarantees to achieve a desirable set of results. A built-in kind of redundancy within the system that makes you go a little bit slower and gives you multiple protection is much more important, because when things go well, there's not much to worry about, and you could keep quite happily. But when they go badly, that's when one thing starts to cascade on the other. So the wisdom of the founders, I think, is general, which is that you fear bad outcomes more than you love good outcomes, and you skew your institutions to make sure that those poor outcomes are going to be avoided by putting into place somewhat of an excess of procedural guardings of one kind or another. That's one thing. But then what happens is we come to the progressive era. I think most of you know something about my work. And I started off, by and large, as a private lawyer, trying to figure out how the theory of proximate causation worked when you had various acts of successive negligence and big stuff like that. And I also did rules on the acquisition of property and freedom of contract and so forth. And as I went on, what I constantly discovered is that there was an intimate and close connection between private law and public law, and that you had to understand how that thing started to work in order to make sure that you would have a public system of law that respected essentially kinds of entitlements. Now, what are perspectives? Well, their attitude is that property rights are not a fundamental piece of the particular equipment. They're an instrumentality, a convenience, and so forth. But that the dominant tropes of the progressives, starting with Woodrow Wilson and his book on congressional governance back in 1885. Wilson was only 29 years old, but the damage was already done. And so what essentially they say is, you got it wrong, Professor. This is the late 19th century. We have railroads. We have all sorts of complicated arrangements and so forth. So what we need to do is to get rid of this particular model of adjudication, which is kind of from the horse and buggy age, and put into place an administrative law system which depends upon two things. One, it depends upon the sort of general public awareness of certain difficulties, of which you then try to solve. And then what you do is you install a regime of experts who are going to solve it for you in some side of a clever way. And that what happens, if you look at this equation, is the middle piece of the problem, mainly the question of property rights, liberties, and so forth, are subsumed under these two areas. And it is assumed that whatever it is you're going to worry about is going to be taken care of by essentially the expertise who put this stuff into place. And that is the single most dangerous assumption in the history of American law. And it basically sets up the contrast between the progressive approach, which is still dominant in the United States, often with great mischief today, and a classical liberal approach, which never loses its intellectual appeal, but is all too often on the defensive. And so what is the outcome of the Wilson approach? Well, the first thing you have is separation of powers, question mark, duh. Why is it we would want, says somebody like Wilson and so forth, to have a procedure which slows things down, when in fact, given the fact that we are putting experts into place, we can do the right thing a lot faster if we don't worry about all these obnoxious niceties which slow up the particular legal system. And so therefore what you do is you start to think about creating administrative agencies, for which there are many valid reasons. I don't want to say that everything has to be run through adjudication. You want a set of tax rolls and things like that. You obviously need administrative agencies. But the scope of the modern administrative state, starting in the late 1880s and going forward to the modern time, essentially is not designed to do routine tasks of determining tax lists, insurance lists, voters lists, and so forth, list. It's designed to have all of these powers to create synthesis of one form or another. And so off you start to go. Well, then you start to ask some questions. Experts. Who's an expert? Well, it turns out, if you look at a lot of these kinds of disputes, there are a large number of would-be experts. And it also turns out when you decide who these experts are, they tend to disagree with each other in many, many ways. And many times they make mistakes which are perfectly apparent to somebody who knows how to read the English language or look at elementary empirical evidence. And so you've got this expertise, and it's a class, but it is not univocal in what it says, and it is not unerring in the way in which it starts to say it. And so how do we think about the fact that there's a political bias is extremely important. And the political bias is much more important than is, in fact, the expertise. Because when you start to hire people for expertise, you now peg them for a particular task, rate-making, patents, and so forth. And what happens is you can develop this particular system, and you can pick your expert to suit your political situations, because unlike judges who work in courts of general jurisdiction, you care about the main thing that this person does, and you can therefore tailor the situation so that the expert meets your political need. Now, how do I know that? Well, we have all these expert independent commissions, and what happens is there's 2 from one party, 2 from the other party, and a chairman who's chosen by the party of the particular president. If you really believed in expertise, why on earth would you start to worry about these political affiliations? Well, the answer is you really don't believe in this kind of expertise any more than you believe that expert witnesses in a trial should have complete and absolute control of everything that's going on. What you need to do is to figure out how to bring these particular characters to heel. And so that then gets to the question of what is going to take place. Well, first of all, what you have to see is the way in which these things work. And we've seen recently, on the last several years, a number of cases that are going to bring this issue to the fore. And in effect, will, I hope, when we have a perfectly competent and sensible Supreme Court, bridge the partisan divides and result in a 9-0 reversal of the situations that we currently have today. And so you start looking at your world's favorite agencies, and at the top of the list is the neutral and unbiased Securities and Exchange Commission. Next to it is the dispassionate and accurate Federal Trade Commission, known for its impartiality on all matters great and small. And then it turns out, also slightly more exotic, is that the Patent and Trade Office has also been subject to this kind of politicization. And these cases start to come up in the courts, and the question is what you're going to do with them. So one of the cases I'm going to talk about is the case of Lucia. Peggy Little basically worked on this for too many years, and we're trying to figure out how it is that we managed to stop the expert state. It's because Congress decided to give the SEC the power to prosecute and then to judge, and they could appoint the particular judge. The expert they appointed in all of these cases was perfectly reliable. The government always won. His expertise was Social Security, but that doesn't matter. Social Security, securities regulation, what difference does it make? We're all experts in everything these days, and so let's do it. And you get this perfect unerring record, and it goes to the Supreme Court. And I'm sorry to say I regard its decision as one of the colossal technical triumphs on the one hand and intellectual disasters on the other hand. There is something known as the Appointments Clause, and what that particular clause says, if you start to deal with appointments of inferior officers, they could be appointed by the president, the courts. We know about that, Ted, don't we? Bad decision. The courts and by the heads of various departments. In a complicated administrative structure, not clear what a department is, not clear what a head of department is, and so they march up, and what they do is they decide this conviction has to be thrown out because the people who did it were not appointed by the heads of the department, so everything was invalid. What a curse. If you want to talk about a Pyrrhic victory, that's it. So you go back into the agency, and you now have a manual certified by the Supreme Court to tell you exactly whom you appoint, how you appoint these people, and so you have absolutely matchless appointments, and then you drag this poor Mr. Lucia through the mud a second time, where he eventually settles out of sheer exhaustion. The simple point that one has to make is that given the enormity of the problem that you are faced with bias, you cannot use the Appointments Clause to start to deal with grievances in individual cases. What you must do is start to look to something else. And so then the question is, what else do you want to look to in these kinds of cases? Well, here again, if you keep with this going, there are questions about jurisdiction stripping on the one hand and questions about substantive due process on the other. And we'll start with the first. Just this past couple of days, we've had 2 actions in the Supreme Court dealing with major statutes, including the SEC. And the question was whether or not, if you put a statute in place which says that an agency can try something, but it gets to try the case before you could raise only at the appellate level, the constitutional infirmities of the structure, is this consistent with separation of powers, due process, and the like? And I think in many ways this is the wrong question. But at least on this particular point, the Supreme Court started to look around and said, you're really going to drag somebody through the mud, and then after it's all done, you're going to give him the option to challenge the constitutionality of the structure? Well, it seems to me, and it seems to every sane person, that if there are serious doubts about this issue, you would rather resolve the on-off question as to whether you can go ahead, instead of going ahead, doing the entire thing at immense cost and expense, and then going to the Supreme Court and having them tell you, oh, you don't have jurisdiction to do this stuff. What you really want to say is under separation of powers, you cannot substitute in an administrative body for a federal district court, and that should be perfectly clear as a categorical rule. And so a statute like this should be essentially condemned on its face as something which violates separation of powers, but it also violates, in any sensible sense, any principle of due process. Because if you start asking yourself whether or not the government is exempt from the notion of bias in the way in which it starts to work its operation, I think that the conclusion that you like to come forward with under these circumstances, not on my watch. The government is filled with human beings with extraordinary powers. If anything is the case, the danger of excessive power and its abuse is going to take place with people who are given by statute authorizations to do things that no ordinary citizen is entitled to do. So that if you're worried about the application of this maxim, you don't want to worry about it with Abe and Jane. What you really want to do is to worry about it with government people who have all these particular situations. And so what you must do here, what you must do in the Cochran case, which has also been raised in the Axon case, is to figure out how you're going to stop this situation. Well, the question is, well, just how bad is this situation? And now I want to switch to the oil states case, which was lost by my good friend Allison Ho, in what I thought to be a travesty, because what happened is the Supreme Court answered the wrong question, incorrectly, I might add, about the question of public rights in the Constitution. The public rights question comes up in the following oblique fashion. What happens is we have a customs office which works for a very long time, starting about 1800, whatever it is. You get all sorts of internal disputes within the Customs Bureau, and somebody says, I can't solve this, I have to give it to my boss. And then there are a lot of cases like this, and it turns out there are a bunch of bosses, and somebody says, you know, we really have to make sure that when we resolve these appeals to our boss, we're going to do them with some degree of consistency. And then slowly what happens is the ad hoc boss becomes a panel, and then the panel turns out to become an Article I court, which doesn't have any of the endowment features associated with Article III. And you put this thing into place, and you keep it there, and then when you get to Murray's lessee and Hoboken case, you got a massive fraud that's going on. And what you do is you prosecute a guy for not essentially paying his monies to the Customs Bureau. And the argument comes back to the other side. Who are these guys to decide this case? They're not an Article III court. And you now are faced with one of these constitutional dilemmas, which happens all the time. You develop by increment a series of structures that are illegal if you try to put them in place by conscious design, and they are ratified by practice before they're ever attacked. And so you've got two choices to make. One is you could blow the whole system up and start to make everything go to an Article III court, and then worry about everything that has been transferred by way of property, money, title, and so forth for the previous 70 years. Or you can, shall we say, romance the Constitution a little bit. And every principled judge follows what my father used to tell me a long time ago. He said, son, when you are dealing with really important questions, sometimes you have to learn to rise above principle. Now, what did my father mean by this particular expression? He says, you get these kinds of novel circumstances brought by the vagaries of histories. You can't be the traditional kind of an original who says, go back to the beginning, because we've already deviated for that for 50 years. It's a lesson that all of us originals, of which I sort of count myself as sometimes one. He says, you then have to face the choice. So you say, okay, we're going to change this. Well, then what are you going to do? Well, you change it. But for everything? No, you can't possibly do that. So you invent a subcategory of rights called public rights for which you change it. And then you have to be very careful that this thing does not expand itself. And in the oil states case, I take strong exception to what my good friend and man I much admire, Justice Clarence Stroud, sort of saying that anything that Congress does becomes a public right, so anything could go into an Article I court or be done before an agency. I want to keep it back to the original situation so that everything else goes into a judicial system. Now, is this just a odd thing? Well, let me just tell you how the oil states comes down. You get the situation where the head of the Patent and Appeals Board gets the power to appoint the judges on an ad hoc basis to decide the case. First thing you note, if you looked at a federal court system, judges are assigned by rotation and for very good reason. It's yet another one of these protections against bias and overreaching. So the case comes down, 2-1 against the government. That's not a problem. We add 2 more judges, 4-3 against the government. We add 2 more judges, including the guy who's the chairman and the vice chairman of the various board, and magically it becomes 4-3 in favor of the government. So if you want to have adjudication of that particular sort, all you need to do is to move it inside an administrative agency. And I submit to you that is not what it is that you want to do when you're starting to deal with any of these particular cases. So how then do you want to deal with this? There is the separation of powers issue, but there's also, I think, the due process issues. There have been a case called Jacquesi recently decided in the Fifth Circuit, in which the issues associated with the structural issues were raised, and the due process issues were dismissed. We're not talking about them, footnote 21. And again, I think I disagree with the kind of approach. And let me explain to you what it is that I am worried about. Well, the first question you're worried about, it's a tough question. You bring something inside the administrative agency, does that strip you of your Seventh Amendment protections for a right to a jury trial? I think it's actually a very hard question. If you go back to the labor cases, the answer was yes, it did it, but that was New Deal times, and today we have to think about it otherwise. But it turns out when the SEC is seeking remedies, it seeks equitable remedies on the one hand and legal remedies on the other. So the Seventh Amendment argument is a bit of a mess because you don't quite know what to do with these compound cases. And you certainly don't want to create a situation where somebody forgets the damages and simply tries to remove somebody from office in perpetuity and say, well, that's an equitable remedy, so therefore you get no kinds of protection. Then there was the question, if you start to look at all these things, maybe it's abuse of prosecutorial discretion under a doctrine like Gundy. Well, Gundy was wrongly decided in my view, and I think the reason was what they did is they delegated down to the Attorney General a particular decision as to whether or not to retroactively apply a rule that required reporting by individuals who engaged in sexual offenses. And the retroactivity problem was a really tough one. So what happens is the correct way to deal with it, since it's a discrete issue like that, is tell Congress you either put up or shut up. You can decide this as well as anybody. To turn it to the Attorney General is to make him into the legislature. And if what he does is says, I think it ought to be retroactive, which was the case, that's the kind of delegation you don't want to have. But prosecutorial discretion on when you bring cases and how you bring cases and so forth is something which you cannot find very effective judicial means to control. And everybody sorts of understands that. And it becomes mainly a management problem where what you try to do is to have supervision over the office so as to get rid of abusive cases, incompetent prosecutors, and inconsistent treatments to get it right. But I think to me, under those particular circumstances, this is not the kind of thing that you would want to do that. But when you look at the due process kind of issues in this particular case, and you see these ad hoc prosecution, that's going to always apply. So if you go back and try to figure out what's happened, is it turns out many people in the United States are very nervous about due process, to put it mildly. I'm looking at some judges who have been very nervous about this. I see them squirming a little bit in their seats, but I won't name anybody, Bill, who might be in that way. But I do think if you then go back, and I'm going to stop on this particular note, and go back to those first two principles that I started to say, there's absolutely nothing when you are dealing with complicated prosecutions under the Securities Act, the patent laws, the FTC, that doesn't deal with the usual stuff of fraud, incompetence of one kind or another, diversion of assets, restitution remedies, and so forth. And if you remember what I said, these theories essentially apply no matter who the parties are, no matter what the subject matter is, and no matter what the particular causes of action are. So I think what we really need in this particular cause is a massive form of simplification in which the justices finally, and I hope they will do this, will say, look, when we are dealing with these particular problems, it is always going to be the case that any adjudication that takes place on any administrative matter has to be taken place before an independent body. I could comfortably live with the historical stuff associated with Article I judges on one hand. I cannot live with a situation where essentially these guys are inside the administrative agencies where those powers of appointment go. One of my maxims, of course, is you try to believe in simple rules for a complex world. You've heard that before. This is a simple rule. That's a complex world. But it turns out the one does a great deal of benefit with respect to the other. And if we get this right, then in effect what we can do is to take the same approach and start to worry about other administrative law questions. And I do think that the revolution will take place, but if we have a clear vision on what it should do, it will take place better and more uniquely. The notion of deference has to be given a very tough look. Why would you want to give deference to individual officials who have all sorts of political biases as well as supposed expertise? Is a very hard question. You have to deal with the non-delegation question in a rather systematic fashion and so forth. So if you go back to my little Roman maxims and bring them forward, what happens is they are agenda for administrative reform, which is as current today as the day they were announced 2,000 years ago. Thank you. Thank you, Ted.